afternoon. And it's time for us to get started because I understand we're on YouTube and they do this live. One time I was just goofing around, having a good time, and found out that I was on YouTube for about a minute and a half having a good time. So I thought, boy, we better just get right to it. Well, I'm so glad you keep coming back. You know, I'm not sure because, you know, some of these studies I was just mentioning, like this one, is all about life isn't fair. And my job is to share with you the truth of the hopelessness of life as he shares it and make it exciting for you. In other words, the only way you can do that is when you really see that that's not at all what he's talking about. So anyhow, we come in our study of Solomon's Journal, and we come, of course, to the last part of chapter 3. And what he shared at the first part of chapter 3, remember, is that there's a plan. And even though there are things that come into our lives, there's always a time. Remember, a time and a purpose behind every event that comes in your life. It's like a big puzzle. The only trouble is that sometimes those pieces that are thrown at us, we look at it and we say, this piece doesn't fit into any puzzle. And so in the last part of chapter 3 and chapter 4, Solomon's going to bring up the objections to what is this thing? Is there really a plan? Does God love you? Yeah. But does he have a wonderful plan for your life? And does God work all things together for your good to those who are called according to God's purpose? In other words, is there going to be a picture at the end of this puzzle and all the pieces are going to fit? Because he says last time that there's a time and a purpose behind every activity, everything that comes into your life. And in his timing, he makes it, remember Yafar, he makes it beautiful. And remember, the word beautiful means not to be afraid that there's something wrong. Many times we talk about things, about beauty and so forth, and we don't go far enough to really explain, what do you mean by that? When you see there's a beautiful sunset, or you see something happen, you say, boy, that's beautiful. What are you saying? Well, you're moved, you're attracted to it. Well, why are you? Because you look at something, and when you have this sense, there is nothing wrong with it. There is nothing wrong, then you have no fear of it, and you're drawn because that's the essence of joy. It's the essence of beauty. And so all these little pieces, these puzzle pieces, all the different things happen to our lives. God, in his time, his appointed time, he will fit that into the puzzle, and he'll make this whole thing a thing that you don't have to be afraid that there's something wrong, because it's all going to be so right. Well, with this, being the kind of wise, double wise man Solomon is, he poses, but there's a problem. There's two objections to this idea that there's a plan, because life is unfair. And sometimes these pieces are so unfair, we have no idea how they fit into some kind of plan. And that's what he's going to address. Why? Why is life unfair? And instead of denying it or trying to put some kind of twist of happiness to it, he's just going to say, here's why God permits for us to live in a world at times is so unfair and confuses us about the pieces of puzzles that we're not too sure is going to make and be part of a plan. So with that in mind, I want to pray for you. You pray for me. And do pray for me. Pray that God would use me to make this clear to you. Because if this really it stinks, it's your fault. You didn't pray. I just want to take the pressure off me, all right? So it's really up to you. You're going to pray or not. You want to be bored or not. So let's take it to the Father. Once again, Father, thank you for giving us the health and the ability and the freedom to be able to come and be able to interact with deep, deep truth. Father, truth that many people would just kind of walk away from, run away from, or they would hear it, or they would speak against it, or they'd get angry at it. But even James warned us, be quick to hear. Look for the wisdom. Dig it out. For the Spirit of God has placed it within the very heart, the very mind, the soul of Solomon, and that you would direct him to leave it all here in a journal for us to learn from his example. And so, Lord, I pray you'd open our hearts, our minds, stretch our thinking, and help us understand. So when it's all said and done, instead of our expectations always being disappointed and angry and frustrated because things are not fair, maybe we could actually have peace. Maybe somehow in a sanctified way you could teach us, where do we need to put those expectations? Maybe we just need to lower them into truth. So, Father, remove our deception. Remove our own sense of wanting to run the world the way we would want to. And then being hurt and angry and frustrated when it doesn't happen. So, Father, open our hearts, we ask in the name of Christ. And God's people said, amen. Well, you remember that time you had that conversation with your dad? First time that your sibling got 2 scoops of ice cream, you got 1. And then you declared something that no one ever taught you. It's almost like it was put within your soul. And it's put within everybody's soul. No one ever has to teach you the fact that life isn't fair. That's not right. I remember, it was just, I think, a couple years after my wife, I was going to say my wife passed away. No, Holly's right here. She's fine. She's doing real well, by the way. When my mother passed away, back in 84, 85, my mom passed away, there was a Thanksgiving. And you remember, Holly, it was kind of a downer because our families were gone. It was just, Holly and I and the 2 young boys and my dad. And he was at an age that he was getting less fun every day. And so, of course, we used to have these wonderful, Holly would put on these wonderful Thanksgiving meals, a celebration of family. And that particular year, Mom's gone, and we've got Dad, and we got the 2 boys. And so what are we going to do? So I had this great idea. We're going to go to Luby's Cafeteria. I'm going to be so loving to Holly, take all that pressure off her. Why ever fix a big meal for just a few of us, guys? So we went to Luby's. And, of course, when the boys found out that we were going to Luby's, they had the worst attitude. Matter of fact, they were really, really unhappy. So I remember we get in line to go into Luby's, and they're kind of complaining, why do we have, this is horrible, Dad. What's wrong with you? And I remember John's first in the line, and he goes, and there's this chicken fried steak. But this one particular chicken fried steak somehow got glued to, connected, bonded to a second piece. So when the guy stuck the knife, to give it to John's plate, he got this huge chicken fried steak. Well, his younger brother, Kent, he's going, whoa, I'm going to get chicken fried steak. And the guy stuck the fork in the normal size, and so Kent gets this half part piece. And I remember Kent looked at me, and he looked at John. And I said, okay, Kent, we'll have the talk. Life is not fair. And yet the interesting thing, no matter how much you talk about it, we don't want to believe it's true. We don't want to believe it's true. I mean, sad endings make us cry when things end and it's not right. Holly and I years ago went to see the movie when it first came out, Romeo and Juliet. Strangest thing, Hollywood Boulevard, real popular. We're waiting outside in a line. And then the show lets out. The people who saw the show are coming out. Women, of course, they're all crying. And the men are struggling with their allergies. I mean, it's really a scary thing when you see men crying. I'm going, do I really want to see this thing? When the bad guys win, we don't get sad. We get what? Mad. Because we still want to believe that life is fair. When you're a little kid, what were you taught about the cafeteria? Get in line. Stay in line. No cutsies. Cannot cut in line. How do you feel when you're on the freeway and they're doing some work and everybody has to go down to what? 2 lanes to 1 lane. So you're being really good and staying in line, just like you were taught as a kid. And every time there's what? Somebody, usually in a pickup truck, somebody will just fly on the side of the road, off the road, and just all the way to the front. And everybody, we're all praying, oh God, nobody let him in. Don't let him in. I mean, it's Christian love. Don't let him in. And of course, I'm praying for the guy. Take him home, Lord. Just take him home. And everybody in the line is just so angry and frustrated. And there's always some weak personality that will let them in. And you just go, that's not fair. So even though we know life's not fair, we still want it to be. And so we talk about this issue of justice. It's interesting. Justice is an ancient concept. And justice, biblically, has always meant simply one thing: God's law. because God's law is the only straight line, is only the definition of what's right. The concept of justice is what is right and what is wrong, what is moral, what is immoral. But if you haven't noticed the last 20 years, the term has been changed. A little poison has been added to the concept of justice, because it no longer means what's right and what's wrong. It means what's fair, what is the same. Everything for it to be fair, everything for there to be justice, everybody's got to be treated the same way. Everybody should have the same thing, and it should be all equity. Equity. Justice equals equity. The only trouble is that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, it's Paul who says, if you do not work, you should not eat. So the Bible never teaches that everything should be the same for everybody. If that was the case, we're either all going to heaven or we're all going to hell if everybody's going to be treated the same way, no matter what how they behave. I was listening to an interview of these students at Florida State University. This young man was interviewing them about the Green Deal. You've heard about the Green Deal. And every student was thrilled. Yeah, we ought to cut down on fossil fuel. Thank you. Fossil fuel. I washed my mouth this morning. Can't do a thing with it. Anyway, we've got to get rid of the fossil fuel. We've got to get rid of gas and the diesel. It's ruining our environment. It's ruining our country. And so they were all for it. Well, then the guy went ahead and in the conversation, he says, now, may I tell you a few things that are in the Green Deal? He says, one thing in the Green Deal is you do know in 10 years there will be no flying and you cannot drive a car. It'll have to be all electric or electric speed trains. That's it. Well, they go, well, that's not right. And then he said, you understand in the Green Deal there's a statement that everybody will receive the exact same medical care. Even people who refuse to work will still receive the same medical care. Even these students said, well, that's not right. And all of a sudden, the word justice moved from sameness, equity, fair, to what's right and what's wrong. And you see, justice has always been the commands, the law of God, of what is right. And not what is right is not always the sameness for everybody, because people's behavior and the consequences of people's choices are different. And so, therefore, here you have this discussion. If you haven't already, open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes, the last part of chapter 3, because Solomon wants to talk about, okay, there's a plan behind life. God takes all the pieces, as we said, but there's two very serious objections to this concept that God has a plan for your life, a wonderful plan for your life. There are two big unfairs that really cause confusion about embracing life. The first unfair is the apparent injustice, the evil, the suffering in this world. And the second is death itself. Death itself. Those are the two big unfairs. And so instead of denying it, Solomon says, let's talk about it. Picks it up in chapter 3, verse 16. He says, furthermore, so let's take this idea of a plan that God has for every one of us, appointed time for every activity, every event comes into your life. Furthermore, I have seen under the sun, remember he's talking about this mortal life, from your physical birth to your physical death, under the sun, that in the place of justice, there's wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, there is wickedness. So I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. So God's going to bring judgment. He's going to judge the righteous man, judge the wicked man in his timing, when it's the appointed time. Verse 18, I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. I'll stop there. And what's he talking about here? He says that the biggest problem, and the reason we have a world that's unfair, and then we have the big two unfairness, injustice and death, in this world and this life we live in, you don't have to go any further than man playing God. That's the source of evil. That's why we live in an unfair world, is because we have in humanity this drive of humans believing they're God, and want to be treated like God, and want to rule the world because they believe they can be gods. And that's what he's going to argue with here, because he says their best attempts. So if you're a God and you're going to play God, then that means you should be able to produce two things. One, justice. You should be able to do the right thing, make decisions that are good, moral, right, consistent decisions. Justice. And the second thing you should be able to do is produce righteousness. Things that are right. Things that are indeed healthy. Things that are successful. Now, where do you find human being, man wanting to play God? That is, we don't need God. We rule ourselves because we can be our own gods. So where do we find man's best attempt at producing justice and producing righteousness? He says where you would expect to find justice, that's the judicial system. That's our courts. Those are our judges. We put the best and the finest up to make those decisions about what's just and what's not just. And yet we look at our judicial system, and what do we find? Do the courts always rule with justice? Do we always see a consistency of wisdom from the best that man can produce in our judicial system? Well, also, you look where you would think you'd find a place of righteousness. Something producing righteousness, health, good, wisdom. Well, you would find that in government. So human beings, we produce government. Judicial system produce justice, and government to produce righteousness. And yet, do we see not just our government, but governments globally and throughout history, do we see them consistently serving, protecting, caring, and being wise towards their people? Oh, no. So the two best attempts man has at trying to play God, God should at least be able to produce justice and righteousness. We put up our best, and what happens? Doesn't happen. Now he go on, because notice he says in verse again 17, so I said to myself, I communed with my heart. God's going to judge both the righteous and the wicked. Yeah, for every matter and for every deed is there. All right, God's going to do it. Matter of fact, the last verse of this journal, chapter 12, the last verse says, and God will judge every action, whether it be good or bad. So God's going to bring judgment. But that's not the issue of fairness, because he's not judging quick enough. See, it's not helpful to, okay, God's one day in his timing is going to bring judgment. But what about now? Why is he waiting? He says, verse 18, again, I commune to my heart, myself, concerning the sons of men. God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are not gods, but they're beasts. Interesting. Some will say, this is pretty much libeling government. And at this time, who's the government? Who's the court system? When Solomon writes this, remember how he introduces himself at the very beginning? He's the what? The king of Israel. And as the king of Israel, he's the one that authors the court system and authors the government. And he is actually owning up to the fact that he can't even pull it off, and God gave him double wisdom. They say, well, no, man would never admit, that he was failing at this. Solomon does. Solomon's the very same one that says, this idea of having 1,000 women in your life, not a good idea. Not a good idea. So Solomon's very open and honest about where he fails, and he's talking about here, this is where he failed. For example, he says, like life under the sun. What is some of this man's attempt to bring out righteousness and judgment and justice? Well, for example, in some states, a girl must have permission from her parents to have her ears pierced. But in those same states, she can get an abortion without her parents even knowing. Now, you just kind of go, does that sound right? Because see, when it says here, there is wickedness when you look for justice. There is wickedness when you look for righteousness. That word wickedness is the Hebrew word rasha. Rasha means bent. The idea is what's right is straight. Straight, what's right. If it's not right, it's bent. And so we're seeing things, decisions coming out of our courts and our governments, and they're not right. They're bent. Here's another one. Some years ago, back in 1978, there's a young girl that was hiking in California, and a man named Larry Singleton attacked her, raped her, cut her arms off. He was put in prison, and he only served 8 years. He was lit out. Later, he killed a mother of 3, but not until he brought lawsuit against the girl who was responsible because of him going into prison. Now, you look at that and you go, that's not right. No, that's bent. In the ruling of the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, there was a conviction of a man accused of fatally injuring a fetus, and it was upheld. The ruling was as follows, and I quote, "Infants who died subsequent to birth due to fetal injuries as human beings, it seems clear that Congress intended fetal infanticide to be included within the definition of murder." The man was convicted, and he served 15-year prison sentence. But now, if death is caused to a fetus by a doctor, it is legal if it's called abortion. You go, that's not right. And the point here is he's simply saying is that man thinks he's a God, thinks he can rule himself. I don't need a God because I'm a God. And I can go ahead and produce and rule myself and others as good as any God could. So here, why do we have an unfair world? We have humanity playing God. They dismiss the Creator, and they think they can do better than Him, and all they produce is bent things from the courts, things from the government that are not right. And any thinking person will see they are not right. Now, we say, but God, why don't you bring judgment right now? Well, here's the question. Delayed justice. Is delayed justice the denial of justice? See, I want to say, well, yeah, real justice means there's consequences now. There's punishment now. And to delay that punishment, to delay those consequences, that's not right. But now what am I doing? Here, a human being, telling God about His business and His timing. You see, God made it very clear to all of us through Peter in 2 Peter. He writes this in chapter 3, verse 9. What if God would have brought punishment on my life before I had time to repent? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. The Lord is not slow about His promises. The context is about the judgment of the flood, that God one time before brought judgment upon mankind. Why isn't He bringing judgment again? He says the Lord is not slow about His promises. What promises? To bring judgment. As some count slowness, but He is patient toward you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. See, apparently God knows. In His infinite wisdom, infinite mind, apparently God knows whether or not somebody eventually will repent and turn from their playing God, their arrogance. And therefore God waits, and God is patient. So Solomon says, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. God is going to, at the right time, bring His judgment. Now, you know what's interesting about this is this really bothers us, and it's going to bother us for hundreds of years more, most likely. The reason is, I don't know when Jesus Christ is coming. It'd be great if He came tonight. That'd be wonderful. But biblically, it could be 200-300 years, all right? But what's interesting, I've taught the book of Revelation numerous times, and I still kind of giggle in chapter 6, verse 10. It's the fifth seal judgment. Now remember, the sealed judgments is when God basically starts giving man over to the consequences of his own actions. So the sealed judgments are not God attacking the earth with judgment. It's just God backing his protective hand away and say, okay, I'm no longer going to protect you from your own decisions and your own technology and the things that you're producing. Now when he gets to the trumpet judgments, different story. You shoot the trumpet, that's an attack. In chapter 8 of Revelation, well, we're not teaching Revelation, but that's the judgments change and they're more aggressive. But the fifth one is there's this horrible persecution of Christians. And it says in verse 9 of chapter 6 of Revelation, and when Jesus, broke the fifth seal, John says, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God, because of the testimony which they had maintained. So apparently this is in the future, and these are believers who have been martyred, murdered, slain, executed in the future during the tribulation time. And by the way, just like Paul said, absent from the body, present with the Lord, depart and be with Christ. Behold, I go to prepare a place for you. If I then go prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself. All of that's true because here they are. But I would think your first day in heaven, you would be really celebrating, right? Apparently not. Watch. Verse 10. And they cried out with a loud voice saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, wilt thou refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Here we still are. It's not fair. They killed us. It's not fair. I did a service years ago for a sweet grandmother, and she had passed away, and I remember she had two little granddaughters, and I could not get them to stop crying. And afterwards, I sat right there in front row. I sat down with them, and I said, you do know your grandmother's okay, and talked about where her grandmother was, what was going on, and I know, Grandma's in heaven, but they wouldn't stop crying. Finally, I said, Darryl, just shut up and listen to the girls. So I said, so why are you crying? Because Grandma's forgotten us. They were so hurt because they knew, because Grandma was in heaven, it's great for Grandma, but now their grandmother has forgotten them. And I never thought a deep study of the book of Revelation would give me the right answer to share with these two little girls. Because why are these people upset? They're dead. Their souls, they're with Christ. They're in heaven, and they remember. They remember how they were killed, which means Grandma remembers her two kids. Anyway, verse 11, and there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while. It's Jesus' way of saying, chill out. While longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, should be completed also. So let's wait for more unfairness. Let's wait for more to be killed of my believers. Now, does he ever get around to judging? Oh, hello. Chapter 20, we find out, and I saw an angel coming down from heaven. And long story short, and it says, and I saw the dead, the great, the small, standing before the throne. Books were open. Another book was open, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. Sea gave up the dead which were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead. And death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Not to worry. God will bring judgment. But even this, towards the end time, he waits another 3.5, maybe 4 years. And these people in heaven are still saying, it's not fair. Apparently, this is deep within us. But again, that's why he's going to answer this by saying, it is not fair for one reason. Mankind believing they can play God and dismissing God. And so, therefore, he says in verse 18, I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them. That word tested is not pass-fail. It's similar to the Greek word dokimazo in the New Testament. It's like the testing gold. It's to bring out what's inside the gold. You take a chunk of gold out of a mountain. It's full of dirt and rocks and air pockets. And so you test it. You do it by fire. You melt it. And all that stuff comes to the surface, the dross. And then what you have is you're really bringing out what's already there. That's what he's saying. He says, apparently God permits unfairness in his creation to continue to bring out something out of the sons of men, Bene Adam, the sons of Adam, the human race. There's something about the human race that's got a problem because of our free choice. And in Genesis 1, God creates man, both male and female. Puts them in this garden, rule the garden, and there they are in Genesis chapter 2. And God kind of backs off. They commune, and God lets them exercise their free choice and rule the world God created. And how does that end up? Genesis chapter 6 with a flood. So God says, all right, let's wash that one away. We're going to give an example this time. We'll have Noah, a righteous man. And we'll give an example of how a man lives his life in submission and worship and honoring of the God who is God. So how'd that turn out? Genesis 11, Tower of Babel. Now we're going to be our own God. We're going to rule ourselves. We're not, God wants us to scatter. No, we're hanging out with each other and be a great nation. And so finally, chapter 12, God says, all right, maybe I'm going to have to get a little more involved. And that's when he makes the promise and the covenant with Abraham. And off to the races we go. But it still keeps coming back that God says, it seems to be innate in human beings to believe that we're God's. So he's going to say, let me tell you why I'm waiting. Why I'm giving time to prove that evil, injustice, and even death did not come from me. So stop blaming me, because God's always the first person we blame. He says, put the blame where it should be. I'm going to bring it out and prove, expose what's inside every human being. And that's all of us, by the way. And so what does he do? He says, I'm going to watch us. So God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts, animals. Now, the way he does this is quite kind of embarrassing, because notice what he says. How humanity. Matter of fact, Michael Novak, who's a Stanford University professor, he made this statement, and it's basically a statement made in most universities today. Quote, it is taken for granted in most intellectual circles that an intelligent person does not believe in God, and certainly not in any institutional religion. Novak goes on to say, indifference to religion is the ordinary mark of the serious intellectual. Indeed, the thesis of the intellectual life in America is that there is no God. So if you want to be intelligent, you better throw out of your mind that there's a God. Now, why is it so intelligent? Why is it an intellectual pursuit to dismiss God out of existence? Well, because we are the apex of the evolutionary process. We're the top dog. And so through evolution, amino acids came together, produced proteins, and by chance, voila. But we're at the top. And being at the top means we're accountable to nobody. We're smarter than anybody else. And therefore, we need to answer to no one else, because we're at the top of the food chain because of the evolutionary truth. But what if we're not at the top? What if there is a God? Well, why doesn't God do something to show that he's there, so that we don't have to feel like we're stupid, unintellectual, because we don't believe we don't have to be answerable to anybody because we're the top. We are God's because we're the top of the mountain. Well, the answer is God has. In Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul is laying out a complete argument about the gospel. And he says this in verse 18. And it's a verse that I've yet to hear anybody try to explain. And I'm quirky enough to explain it. He says in chapter 1, verse 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress truth in unrighteousness." Now, what truth are they suppressing? The question, all right, God, if it's the intellectual pursuit to realize that we've evolved and we're the top of the evolutionary apex, therefore, of course, we're smarter than anybody, superior to anybody, answerable to no one, and therefore we can rule ourselves and rule each other. That's just logical. But it says here that because that which is known about God is evident within them, God made it evident to them. Who do you think put within every human being this innate understanding of justice? That's not fair. That's not right. C.S. Lewis, remember, he called it the moral law that God put within, being the moral lawgiver. That's what brought him from being an atheist to a believer, is he could not explain. He could not explain the existence in every human being of this deep desire for justice. So he says, because God put it in there. That should give you a clue that does not come out of amino acids. They've done all kinds of experiments with chemicals, and they never have the result, something come out and saying, that's not fair. I thought that was funny, but gee, I guess not. He says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, we've talked about this, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through that which has been made, so they're without excuse. Now, I understand. So God has made himself known by his creation. We know about his eternal power by looking at the size of the universe. We know about his divine nature, his intelligence, by looking at the complexities of the universe. I mean, how can you take everything down to law, down to algorithm, down to math? How do you send some guy to the moon, different things to Mars? It's only because there are these laws that are instilled in and from a great intelligence into this whole creation. It's not chaos. If it was all chaos, we could not predict, or math would make no sense. But then he says this, for even though, because I want to know, what is this wrath of God being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness? What is this wrath of God being revealed today and being suppressed by intellectuals? Well, look at a little clue, verse 21. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or gave thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, intellectual, they became fools. For the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God, God for a corruptible form of an image of man, birds, four-footed animals, crawling creatures. Now, here's what's interesting to me. In verse 24, what's God's response? Therefore, God gave them over to the lust of their hearts. Verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to their degrading passions. Verse 28, and just as he did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to the depraved mind. What do you think the wrath, the orge of God that's being revealed every day, that's being suppressed by man? He keeps giving man over to the consequences. He's testing man because man thinks he can play God, and man consistently fails throughout history because he cannot produce the very two things that God can produce: justice and righteousness. And not only that, these individuals who are playing like they're God, he says the truth is they were given the same breath as human beings. They are as fragile as animals. He says, I want you to see, and I want them to see that they are like beasts. And this is a verse, go back to verse 19 now of chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. He says, let me explain. For the fate of the sons of men, the fate, okay, our future, and the fate of beasts is the same. So my future is the same as a dog. How so? Well, as one dies, so dies the other. Oh. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. Havel, their life passes quickly. He says, all go to the same place. All came from the dust. All return to the dust. Now, do you see a little humor there? Those of you who think you're a God and you can rule yourself in life and you dismissed me out of existence because you're so intellectual. Yet the reality is, one, you can't produce what a God produces. And then number two, you're as fragile as an animal. Your life is as short as an animal. You came from dust. You're going to go back to dust. The very breath that I breathed into animals to animate their life is the same breath I breathed into you to animate your life. Quite frankly, in this world, with your body, why do you have the audacity to believe you could be a God and act like a God? He goes on, who knows that the breath of a man ascends upward and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? This is an interesting verse. In the Hebrew, you got two participles here with an article. Now, I don't want to hurt you, but basically here's what it means. What he's saying is that who knows that the breath of man, that is the breath that ascends upwards, and the breath of beast, that is the breath that goes downward. This is the verse we usually go to when little kids ask us what question? Will my dog go to heaven? Will my cat go to heaven? Are there animals in heaven? And you know, this is where we got to be really careful. Remember John MacArthur, who's a great Bible teacher, great prophetic ministry. And I was watching this Q&A time. A little girl came to the microphone, and she had done her homework. And this is with all these theologians and all these guys. And John's kind of serious, theologian guy. But this little gal comes to the microphone and says, Dr. MacArthur, in the book of Revelation, it says that when Jesus returns, he'll be riding a white horse. Are there animals in heaven? What a great question with a little bit of biblical research. And John was so sweet. He looked at her and he says, sweetheart, that is a great question. Then he paused. And then he looked at her and he said, no. That's how John does it. No. Kid breaks out in tears, but no. But his point is this, and maybe a better way to put it is from this verse. Knows how it begins. Who knows? Who knows? That's actually the Hebrew word where is it here? Mayota. Mayota is this, it's in the air. Who knows? When you ask yourself the question, well, do dogs go to heaven? Do cats go to heaven? I am pretty sure cats don't. But do dogs go to heaven? Do animals go to heaven? Will there be animals in heaven? The answer that really we have right here from this verse is very simple. We don't know. We don't know. Now, one would say, MacArthur says that heaven is really reserved for those who have eternal souls. And those are basically angelic beings and human beings. There's no evidence in the scripture that animals have an eternal spirit or eternal, so that the idea is that their spirit goes down. But there is something interesting. It seems like right here, Solomon says, who knows if the breath of a man goes up and a breath of an animal goes down. He says, who knows? But at the end, he seems to have a little more clarity, because in chapter 12, when he's describing the moment of our death, and we go back to dust. In chapter 12, verses 6 and 7, he says, remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. The pitcher by the well is shattered and the wheel of the cistern is crushed. It's a picture there. They lived in a desert. Everybody lived off the well in the center. And there was a rope that was tied to a jar that basically the ladies would go ahead and put it down into the well, bring up the water, pour the water into their vessel, take the water to their home. They would live. Water was life-giving in the desert. And the picture here is that cord is broken, that vessel is crushed, the jar to bring it up no longer exists. He's describing that last breath, that moment when you cannot take that last breath. And at that moment, he's describing the moment of death. Now he says, and here's what happens, verse 7. Then dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Now that's a little different than what he said at first. Who knows that the breath goes up and the breath of the animal goes down? We don't know. But by the time he gets to the end of his journal, and at the end, apparently God has given him real insight. The same insight that God apparently gave Job. Job, in Job chapter 9, Job basically is the first one to ask that remarkable question that if a man dies, will he live again? Now, what is unique about the book of Job is that it's most likely the oldest book in the Bible. So here is this ancient. Some feel that it was written around the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And here you've got Job. And Job is going to make this interesting statement in chapter 14. Did I say 9? Excuse me. Chapter 14, verse 14. And Job says this, if a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my struggle I will wait until my change comes. Now what change is Job? So he says, if a man dies, will he live again? And he speaks about, I'll wait until my change comes. Well, then in chapter 19, Job says this in verse 25. And as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the last, he will take his stand on the earth. Even after my skin is destroyed, this body goes back to what? Dust. Yet from my flesh I shall see God, whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes shall see, and not another, and my heart faints within me. You know, even there's an interesting psalm. In Psalm 49, see, there's some people that say that, well, the Old Testament's not really clear whether or not, there's life after death. But I don't know, because I read these. For example, in Psalm 49, verses 14 and 15, the psalmist writes this, as sheep, they are appointed for Sheol. Speaking of, we are like sheep, human beings. And Sheol was the grave, Hebrew word for grave. Death shall be their shepherd, and the upright shall rule over them in the morning. How's that? And their form shall be for Sheol to consume, so that they have no habitation. So describe when a person dies, they go to the dust, they go to the grave. But somehow the righteous will rule over those who've died or in the grave. I'm confused. Read on, next verse. But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. How do you read that? Am I making this stuff up? Basically what he's saying there is that there is life after death. But back to here, chapter 3, the point that Solomon's making is, why is life unfair? It's because humanity's convinced itself it's a God. And therefore we're the apex, the smartest, superior of all things. Therefore we're answerable to nobody because we rule ourselves and each other as a God. The only problem, Solomon says, is you don't perform very well because you're not a very kind God. You're not a very effective God. Because first of all, you can't produce the two things God produces, justice and righteousness. And the second thing is you're as fragile as an animal. You're as temporary as an animal. And you will die. You will, because you are so fragile and separated yourself from me, you have been the one to introduce death into the universe. So the two big unfairs, injustice, evil, suffering, and death, are all remain and permitted by God to prove, to test the humanity, to prove humanity one thing. So the wrath of God is being revealed. What? God is revealing the consequences of human beings playing God. And if you just look around and you see we are not doing very well when we play God. Just maybe we ought to let God be God, and we're not. And so he ends with verse 22. Here's his conclusion. And I have seen that nothing is better than that a man should be happy in his activities. Isn't that interesting? You would think up to this verse, those who would say, Solomon's cynical and he's pessimistic and he's negative. And it is, so far this discussion has been pretty much a downer, hasn't it? And then he ends with this: so therefore, because of this, be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? What he's saying is that you want to enjoy life? Yeah, there's a plan God has for your life. And instead of you trying to control the pieces, interpret the pieces, make a decision whether the pieces are going to fit in or not, why don't you stop telling God how to do his business? Why don't you understand the essence of humility is simply this: God is God and I am not. And when I play God and try to be God, I am miserable. Why? When's the last time you got angry? When's the last time you were frustrated and angry and miserable? Don't share. That's not a share. And don't come to me afterwards and tell me what it was. But I will tell you why. I will tell you what made you so angry and frustrated and miserable. It's because you're ticked you weren't being treated as a God. Because two perks of a God. Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. May you be treated with holiness. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I get ticked when I'm not treated the way I feel I should be treated. They're not paying attention to me. They're not calling me. Hey, my kids don't ever call me. I'm not being treated like I should be treated. How should I be treated? I should be treated as a God. Holy in the name is Darryl. So you got angry because you didn't like the way you were being treated, disrespected, whatever it was. But that's the reason. Or you were angry because things weren't going your way. Your will was not being done on earth as it is in heaven. And it made you angry. Now, we're never going to admit that. Well, I'm angry because I'm not being treated like a God. I'm not being treated the way I should be treated, and my will's not being done on earth as it is in heaven. We're never going to say that. But 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, hamalekeo, say the same thing God says about our sin, truth, then we're going to learn a lot about ourselves. And what do you walk away? Only reason I got angry and frustrated and miserable is because I'm playing God. And I expect people to treat me as God. And I expect to be able to perform as a God. And those are where my expectations are. And that's why I'm always disappointed, always frustrated, and always angry. But what does he say here? I got a better idea. There's nothing better than for a man should be happy in all his activities. For that is his lot. What's his lot? God is God. Why don't we let God do what God does? God put the pieces together. God interpret the pieces to be something beautiful as he puts them into the picture. Meanwhile, I know one thing. It's the key to my happiness. I'm not God. And so I don't play God. I don't try to be God. I don't focus my whole life on the way I'm treated. And I don't focus my whole life trying to get my will done. Because I am not God. Therefore, I am freed to be not God. I love being not God. Because when I see people around me all trying so hard, even in their unconsciousness, and what does God do? He keeps revealing his wrath from heaven, and he gives us over to the consequences of our visions of divinity, and hoping that we would begin to see we've been tested. It's been exposed in us even. Forget about everybody else. In us. That my problem is simply this. I'm the source of most of the suffering, pain, and anger in my life and around. Because every time I try to play God. So that's what he's saying. What he's saying is enjoy life and get your expectations correct. Stop expecting people to treat you other than not God. And stop expecting them to treat you as God. And you're going to find, he says, you're going to actually enjoy and be happy in your activities. And so when everything's said and done, what he's simply saying in summary is this. The world's not fair. God, why isn't it fair? It must be your fault. God goes, not my fault. World's not fair because human beings continually in arrogance and pride dismiss me, and so they believe they can rule their own world. And so they rule their own world, and they produce anything but justice, anything but righteousness, and they are mere creatures that will return to the dust. And it's only their pride and deceptive arrogance that makes them think that they can somehow rule and be treated as a God. And so he says wisdom is, God is God, you're not. If you embrace it, you'll be a lot happier in all the activities of your life. So stop doing God's business and stop telling God what his business ought to be. That makes sense? God bless you. Thanks for coming.